It's post-World War II Sweden. The war is over, but the country is facing a new national crisis. Cavities. Literally 99.99% of the population has a tooth decay problem. The government's like, we gotta do something. So they commissioned a study. Except instead of asking for volunteers, they ran the study at Vipeholm Mental Institution, Sweden's largest facility for people with severe intellectual disabilities. We're talking people who couldn't consent, couldn't advocate for themselves, couldn't just walk out. So here's what they actually did. Starting in 1947, researchers fed 660 patients an absolutely criminal amount of candy. Not regular candy. They literally had a confectionery company cook up a special extra sticky toffee designed to cling to teeth like it just signed a 10-year lease. It was Halloween every single day. They were handing out up to 24 pieces a day. The whole point was to watch the teeth rot in real time. By the time the sugar phase ended, around 50 patients had their teeth completely destroyed. And what did they do about the ruined teeth? For patients who couldn't cooperate with treatment, they just pulled all the teeth out. There was absolutely no attempt to restore them. Nobody was prosecuted, the ethics debate didn't really even start until the 1990s, which is wild, and the researchers defended it by saying the results were scientifically valuable, which, okay, sure, but at what cost? Sweden still has Lördagsgodis, aka Saturday candy, as a tradition. The whole kids should only eat sweets once a week rule, that came directly from this study. So if you've ever met a Swedish person who treats candy like it's a scheduled government appointment, you now know why. Here I thought Sweden was just ABBA, IKEA, and Zara Larsson. It's 1969 in the United Kingdom. A researcher named Peter Elwood is studying iron deficiency in South Asian women living in Coventry. The question being studied was reasonable. Why do South Asian women have higher rates of anemia? Is it the phytate in wheat flour blocking iron absorption? The execution? Terrible. Just imagine, you're a newly arrived immigrant woman in Coventry. You barely speak English because this is pre-Duolingo. You go to your general practitioner because you've been having migraines. He says it might be anemia, but don't worry, they've got something to help. Then every morning, a van pulls up outside your house. A really sweet man hands you a fresh, warm flatbread to eat. It's just for you, not anyone else in your family. Every afternoon, he comes back to make sure you've eaten it. You're thinking, wow, this country really cares about me. Eventually, another van arrives to take you for a hospital checkup to see if the new diet is working. Except the van isn't taking you to a hospital, it's taking you to the Atomic Energy Research Establishment. The study recruited 21 Indian immigrant women who had just moved to the UK, women who were navigating a completely new country, women who couldn't properly read the consent forms because they weren't fluent in English. They were told they were receiving medicine to improve their health. What they were actually given were rotis made with flour containing iron-59, a radioactive isotope. They ate radioactive bread without knowing it was radioactive. Afterwards, researchers literally scanned their bodies to measure the radiation being emitted to track how much iron they absorbed. The whole thing stayed under the radar until a 1995 documentary by Channel 4 investigated it. When journalists tracked down the women, they had zero idea radioactive material had been involved. And in true bureaucratic fashion, the Medical Research Council basically said the radiation dose was equivalent to about 3 months of background radiation, so the health risk was low. No, that's not the point. The issue isn't whether it was low, the issue is that you fed people radioactive food without telling them. No one was prosecuted, no one apologized. They never check what happened to those women or their children. The UK really does have crazy PR because how do they always get away with everything? It's widely recognized that the experiments carried out at Nazi concentration camps were some of the most horrific crimes ever committed under the label of medical research. And somehow, the ethical debate that came after this one is almost as disturbing as the experiment itself. At Dachau concentration camp, Herr Dr. Sigmund Rasche was given a task by the German Air Force. How do you save pilots who crash into the freezing North Sea and die from hypothermia? Between 1942 and 1943, around 300 to 400 prisoners, mostly Jewish and Polish men, were forced into tanks of ice-cold water for up to 3 hours. Some were immersed up to their necks. Some were fully submerged. Others were stripped naked and left outside in the freezing Polish winter air. Many victims were simply left to die. Others were pushed to the brink and then rewarmed using different methods to test what worked. Hot baths, open flames, even body heat from female prisoners. Rasche recorded everything. Rectal temperature, heart rate, blood composition, and level of consciousness. Dude would have loved Excel sheets. Anyway, the hot bath method worked best and eventually became the standard treatment for hypothermia. Even presented his findings at a medical conference in 1942. Approximately 80 to 90 people died directly from these experiments. After the war, the data was was compiled into a classified U.S. military report, and over the next few decades, more than 45 scientific publications cited it, because the research answered questions that, for ethical reasons, can never be replicated again. To this day, some researchers argue that if the data can save lives, refusing to use it wastes the victim's suffering. Others argue that citing it at all legitimizes the crimes and disrespects those who were tortured and killed. As for Russia, he was executed in 1945, not for human experimentation, but for illegally adopting children who were not considered sufficiently Aryan. The same system that let him freeze hundreds of people to death ended him over paperwork and racial bureaucracy. Make it make sense. So, during the Apartheid-era in South Africa, all white men were required to serve in the South African Defense Force. When they showed up, they were examined by a doctor to determine if they were gay. Later, women serving in the Navy and Air Force were screened too. And if you were suspected of being homosexual, you got sent to Ward 22. Ward 22 was run by a psychiatrist named Aubrey Levin, who believed he could cure homosexuality. First came aversion therapy. Soldiers were strapped to chairs and forced to look at naked photographs of the same gender. If they showed any physical response, they were given electric shocks. The goal was to basically Pavlov their brains into associating gay thoughts with pain. An intern who was forced to observe described a lesbian subjected to shock so severe that her shoes literally flew off her feet. When that didn't work, they escalated. Soldiers were drugged in a process called narcoanalysis to put their brains in a malleable state and then subjected to more conditioning. If that failed, they were shipped to a farm in the middle of nowhere that functioned as a forced labor camp. They were deprived of food and sleep there and had to endure brutal physical labor. And when that still didn't work, the program performed castrations, and according to a report published by the late 1990s, approximately 900 men and women, many of them teenagers, were subjected to involuntary sex reassignment surgeries. These procedures were often incomplete and left survivors medically stranded, halfway between male and female, with no follow-up care. The program ran for 20 years, but apartheid ended in 1994 and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started investigating. Levin didn't show up. He fled to Canada and got himself a medical license in Alberta. He practiced there until 2010. That year, a patient secretly recorded him committing sexual assault during a consultation. 30 men came forward, and he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. In 1950s America, testing contraceptives was basically illegal in multiple states. In Massachusetts, where the researchers were based, they could have actually been arrested. So, Gregory Pincus, the biologist behind the pill, needed a workaround. He chose Puerto Rico because it had no anti-birth control laws and, in his words, had a pool of motivated candidates. That pool was desperately poor women in the slums of San Juan. The pill was presented as a drug that prevented pregnancy. What they weren't told is that it was still experimental. There was no safety data. The dose they were receiving was about 3 times higher than what would eventually hit the market. When women reported severe nausea, vomiting, dizziness, migraines, and blood clots, researchers brushed it off. Reasoning was that women in Boston, who were also in smaller trials, weren't complaining as much, so the Puerto Rican women must be exaggerating. 3 women died during the trials. No autopsies were performed to determine whether the pill played a role. No formal investigation. The researchers just moved on. When complaints grew louder at the American test sites, those trials were paused. The Puerto Rico trials continued for years after. By 1960, the Food and Drug Administration approved the pill. It was marketed to American women as a symbol of freedom and independence. Meanwhile, the Puerto Rican women who endured the highest doses, side effects, and the unexplained deaths couldn't even afford it once it hit the market. The original price for the pill was 50 cents a pill, too expensive at the time. Subscribing to this channel, on the other hand, has always been free. Imagine your boss says, "Hey, I have an easy assignment for you. 2 months, 3-day weekends, you'll just be testing field jackets and gear." Sounds like a great side quest, right? That's exactly how the US Army pitched Edgewood. From 1948 to 1975, the Army ran a classified human testing program. Soldiers were told they would be evaluating equipment. Instead, they were being used to test chemical warfare agents. Surprise! The Army was working through a menu of 254 different chemical substances, nerve agents, psychedelics, incapacitating compounds, and more. They needed to know what these did to the human body, so they used their own soldiers. About 7,000 military personnel and 1,000 civilians were exposed over the years. They were given drugs via injection, pills, inhalation, and skin exposure. Many had no idea what they were actually taking. When the soldiers asked, "Is this dangerous?" they were told, "Nothing here could ever harm you." The worst long-term damage came from a drug called BZ, a powerful agent that throws your brain into full delirium mode, not a fun, trippy high. This was 36 to 96 hours of terrifying hallucinations, full cognitive shutdown, loss of motor control, and total detachment from reality. Veterans who went through the BZ experiments said things like, "There wasn't that much left of me by the time they got done with me." Some developed Parkinson's-like tremors that followed them for decades. And because history loves a cursed crossover episode, the program employed 8 former Nazi scientists. The lead psychiatrist, James Ketchum, defended the experiments until his death in 2019, claiming that chemical weapons were more humane than bullets. The program was shut down in 1975 after Congress investigated. No one was charged. In the late 1950s, a psychiatrist named Dr. Viola Bernard convinced an adoption agency in New York to deliberately separate identical twins and triplets and place them in different homes. Her reasoning was that twins would form stronger individual identities if they weren't raised together. She had no data supporting this, by the way. Researchers visited the adoptive families regularly under the guise of routine check-ins. In reality, they were secretly filming, testing, documenting, and comparing the children's development. Neither the children nor the families were ever told that their child was a twin or triplet, or that they were part of a study. At least 11 sets of twins and 1 set of triplets were separated this way. 3 of those separated individuals later died by suicide. In 1980, the 3 triplets, Bobby, Eddie, and David, accidentally found each other at age 19. One showed up to college, and strangers kept greeting him as if they knew him. Turns out they thought he was someone else. That someone else was his identical twin. Then a third brother surfaced. Overnight, it became a feel-good reunion story. But the media never fully grappled with the fact that these babies had been deliberately kept apart for someone else's academic curiosity. And the researchers who did this never published the findings because they feared public backlash. And Neubauer literally sealed the entire archive at Yale University until October 25, 2065. He died in 2008. The records remain sealed. It's 1944. Allied forces are pushing through Europe. Aid organizations are looking at liberated territories filled with millions on the brink of starvation. And then they realize they don't actually know how to safely refeed a starving population. One wrong move with the wrong food and they will die. Enter Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota, who recruits 36 men for a year-long study. These men knew exactly what they were signing up for. They volunteered because they wanted to help. For the first 3 months, they ate normally. Then came 6 months of deliberate semi-starvation, about 1,570 calories per day, mostly potatoes, turnips, bread, and macaroni. Monotonous meals designed to mimic famine conditions in Europe. Their body weight dropped by roughly 25%. The physical effects were brutal but predictable. Fatigue, weakness, dizziness, cold intolerance, and slowed heart rate. But what blindsided everyone was what it did to their minds. The men became completely obsessed with food. They talked about it constantly. They read cookbooks for fun. Some of them started collecting recipes with no intention of making them. They had dreams about food. They lost interest in hobbies. Their social lives deteriorated. Romantic relationships fell apart. Several men experienced severe depression during the study. One participant even cut off 3 of his fingers with an axe. At first, he claimed it was an accident. Later, he admitted he wasn't entirely sure. When the starvation phase ended, the men were given food again, and many couldn't stop eating. They ate until they were physically ill and kept going. One man said he ate so much that he had to be restrained. Some continued struggling with disordered eating patterns for years after the study ended. The data Keys collected shaped modern understanding of how to treat famine victims. It is still used by humanitarian organizations today. Dr. J. Marion Sims is often credited with developing the surgical repair for vesicovaginal fistula, a complication of difficult childbirth that left women leaking urine continuously. His technique transformed lives, and he's frequently called the father of modern gynecology. There are even statues of him. The plaques don't tell you is that he developed this technique by performing repeated surgeries on enslaved black women in Alabama between 1845 and 1849. Vaginal surgeries were done without anesthesia, often in front of other physicians. One woman, Lucy, almost died from sepsis after he left a sponge inside her urethra and bladder. Another woman, Anarcha, was operated on up to 30 times. Women like Anarcha, Lucy, and others were enslaved, meaning they had no legal ability to refuse. Supporters of Sims often argue that anesthesia wasn't widely available at the time or that the surgeries weren't considered extremely painful. But later, when Sims perfected his technique and operated on white women, he did use anesthesia constantly. Eventually, Anarcha's fistula was repaired after about 30 procedures. She was then used to train other surgeons. She received no compensation, no acknowledgement in any medical paper, and no freedom. Her name appears only in Sim's memoir. As if that weren't horrific enough, Sims also experimented on enslaved babies with neonatal tetanus. He tried to correct their skull bones, which he believed were misaligned, and the procedures had a 100% mortality rate. Multiple statues of Sims had been removed since 2017, including one in Central Park, but memorials still exist. The hospital in South Carolina bears his name, and he is in the Alabama Hall of Fame. The debate continues. How do we acknowledge medical advances built on abuse? In the 1920s, the Soviet secret police ran a covert toxicological research lab known as the Camera, which translates to the chamber. Its sole purpose was to develop the perfect assassination poison, something lethal, fast-acting, and undetectable at autopsy. Prisoners already condemned to death were used as test subjects. They were told that they were receiving medical treatment or vitamins. Instead, they were given doses of ricin, mustard gas, digitoxin, potassium cyanide, nerve toxins, and various other experimental compounds. Researchers watched and documented how they died, what dosage kills within a precise time window, how long until organ failure, what symptoms appear first. What would an autopsy show? Could it be disguised as a heart attack? A stroke? Natural causes? The answers were intended for real-world political assassinations. During its most active period, the lab was headed by a toxicologist named Dr. Grigory Myronovsky, who ran it from at least 1937 to 1951. He conducted thousands of human experiments. In internal reports, he described his findings with clinical detachment, dosage amounts, symptom timelines, and efficacy rates, like a pharmacist discussing prescriptions. He was eventually imprisoned, not because of what he did in the lab, but for political reasons related to a post-Stalin power struggle. He died in 1964. The Camera is believed to have continued in some form well into the Cold War era. In 2006, former Russian intelligence officer Alexander Litvinenko was assassinated in London with polonium-210, a rare radioactive isotope. His death took 3 agonizing weeks. Standard autopsies don't detect polonium without specific radiological testing. Investigators took notes of that. That choice wasn't random. It required specialized knowledge of toxicology and concealment. Maybe this is how Walter White got the idea about ricin too. Some of the people who ran these experiments never faced consequences. Some of them were celebrated. Some of them also helped create treatments we use today. And that's the part that makes it complicated. So yeah, bring it up at dinner. Make it awkward. Ciao, ciao. Subscribe now.